growth to everybody. But obviously, when you are in a specific country at a specific time or in a specific sector of activity, you might be suffering the consequences of those adjustments. It doesn't mean that that's negative for globally speaking, or that that's negative for the economy in general terms. It means that, well, let's put it that way, you are not at the right place at the right moment. But then is where I think the mobility of the people becomes a very important issue. And the question of migrations, which is again another enormous challenge that the world has to face. Migration, normally we think of migration only of the very poor, and that's of course in numeric terms the most important one. But migration also of qualified people is extremely important. The question of the brain drain has been extremely important in developing countries for many, many, many years already. So this is a huge challenge. How do you cope with these big movements that somehow our globalized world has made even more unavoidable than they were before? And there we have some problems because for the time being, for instance, the multilateral system is not well equipped to deal with this. For instance, the UN practically has no competences in dealing with migration. So it's something that we will have to develop in the coming years.
On the aisle.
The question, does the Mediterranean Union, South American Union, and the African Union operate similarly towards the European Union? And also, how does the formation of new unions affect the world geopolitically? And is there a possibility for there to be an Asian Union and a North American Union? And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, from our point of view as European Union, we firmly think that regional integration is a good response to the problems of today and of the foreseeable future. So we have permanently favored the establishment of other unions, as you have called them. And they call themselves in some cases. The African Union is one case. In other cases, they take other names. But it's this idea of regional integration. We think that regional integration has worked for us, but we think that it can work for others. And in reality, there is a relatively important trend in the world to develop regional integration. For instance, in the case of Latin America, there are different integration processes going on, Mercosur, Central American market, etc. Some of them basically, for the time being, oriented to the economy and to create free trade zones, etc. But not only economic. Certainly is the case also in Africa, where there are different sub-regional organizations that have been created, and now the African Union is having a new life and taking very rapidly more and more responsibilities, also in terms of crisis management, peacekeeping in Africa, etc. So there is a clear trend in that respect, and we think that is positive. And generally speaking, from our side, we have always tended to favor that approach. And for instance, when we go to negotiate with Latin American countries on terms of trade and economic relations, we normally ask them to negotiate with us as a region and not individually as a country. And for instance, our negotiations are with Mercosur, or are with the Andean community, or take part with the Central American organization. So we definitely are in favor of more regional integration. We think that is good for peace in those regions. We think that there is an economic basic idea of a scale which is there, and of complementarity in the region that is in most of the cases positive. So we definitely think that is important. Obviously, when you are a country like the United States, the question is different because your size is already so huge that you don't need to integrate with anybody. Or to put it in another way, if you integrate with somebody, it would be more an absorption than any other thing. But certainly for medium-sized countries, we think that it's a very positive trend.
Yes. And we have time for 2 more questions. Yes.
My name is Sam Rafaelidis. I'm particularly concerned about the European approach to solving the integration of 2 additional states in Europe, particularly Serbia and Macedonia. Could you comment on the obstacles and or preconditions that exist and to what extent they're being addressed by the EU?
Thank you. Let me start by saying that with all the doubts that exist, we were discussing before about further enlargement, the need to deepen the integration process in order to enlarge more, etc. There are 2 things that are quite clear. One of them is precisely that the Balkan countries, which of course Serbia and Macedonia both are part of it, have already a commitment from the EU that they will become part of the EU one day. So that's a principle which is already there. And it has been established in different treaties, different laws, different political declarations and decisions of the European Council, etc. So the question is not if they are going to become members. They are going to become members. The question is when. And when is more difficult to say, but there are certain conditions that have been set by the European Union for another state to become member of the Union. Those are known as the Copenhagen criteria, because those were criteria that were fixed by a European Council that met in Copenhagen a number of years ago. And there are some parameters. Some of them refer to freedoms, democracy, respect for human rights, etc. Some others refer to the readiness of the economy of that country to, among other things, survive the shock of becoming part of the single market, that is the EU. The EU is a single market the same way that the US market is a single market. If you even go a little bit further, sometimes I think that it's even more single market than the US single market. Sometimes you have more barriers between states here in the US than we have in the EU among our states on certain trades and certain health issues, etc., phytosanitary issues, etc. So there are these conditions, these criteria, and that have to be established. That's one thing. When you meet those criteria, you can join the EU if there is a decision that you will join. Now, there is another phase that has to be accomplished, that is the adaptation of your country to the EU. And that is a very long process of negotiation, because it means that from the first more important law to the very last regulation of the country has to be in accordance with EU law. That means, seems very simple, but means hundreds of thousands of pages that have to be revised and be sure that they are compatible with what we call the acquis communautaire, which means basically the backlog of our laws and regulations. That is a long process in itself. It's a purely, if you want, mechanical process, but it's a long one. But the fundamental one is that you meet the Copenhagen criteria.